Islands are supposed to be escapes. They are the places you go to disappear from your life for a night, a week, a year, a neat, finite removal from the small violences of mainland living. But sometimes that removal turns the world into something thin and exposed, and the quiet that drew you there becomes the thing that notices you. Tonight I'm bringing you 3 spine-chilling true tales of island horror that will haunt you. 3 nights where isolation didn't soothe, it sharpened. Each story is a first-person account, told as the person who lived it remembers it. A young adult who booked a cottage off the coast of Maine and woke to a voice at their door. A structural engineer with a rare permit to explore Hashima's concrete skeleton and the evidence of recent inhabitants nobody wanted to acknowledge. And a college senior whose illegal night trip to North Brother Island ended with a voice that sounded exactly like a friend, calling from somewhere it shouldn't have been. All 3 accounts end with questions more than answers, and each narrator leaves us with a fear that stayed with them long after they left the island. Listen closely. These are reported true, as told to me. The first narrator booked the cottage because they needed to get away. They were 22, exhausted in that particular way of being so young and worn out that the rest of your life feels like a list you can't check off. Colorful past, they called it when they told the story. Not an explanation, just a tone. A co-worker had mentioned a small off-hours island with a handful of rental cottages. They were the kind of place that only rented to people who wanted the silence. The co-worker said they hadn't told anyone else about it. That detail swelled later, like something that didn't fit the shape of the rest of the story. The cottage was farther from the dock than it looked on the listing. A narrow dirt path threaded through low, salt-stiff grasses, and the house sat close to the shoreline, with a view of a grey, lumpy horizon. It was the sort of place where the sea was the loudest neighbour. Inside, the rooms felt small like jars. The curtains were thin and translucent, so the interior bled pale shapes into the day. Sunlight made the kitchen look like a set. The deadbolt had a new, bright plate that didn't match the rest of the hardware, and the chain latch scraped in a way the narrator later noticed when sleep loosened their grip on attention. Small things, they remembered, the cheap lamp with a twisted shade, the cheap clock that would stop at random hours, an old paperback with a coffee ring on the first page. They unplugged, more or less. Phone on airplane mode, charger tucked away after the battery started dying faster than it should. Fatigue did most of the work. You know, the surrender where your hands drop and the noise of the world gets muffled, like it's under a blanket. They fell asleep on the couch, with the television muted to a blue scene. At some point in the dim of the night, awareness returned as a physical, concrete pressure in the chest. A sound, not loud but exact, registered wrong in the house. A footstep deliberately placed, then a long pause. Another step at a different distance. Slow, like someone was testing the floors, mapping their way by the creaks. The narrator remembers the way time dilated. You keep thinking, that was the heater, that was the house settling, and then the pattern repeats and you realize you're not explaining it away. There were footsteps circling the cottage, and between each step, the narrator could hear the way the air changed, the small intake of breath from the other side of the wall, the faint rasp of a flashlight swiping across the curtain. At the window, a cone of light moved like an animal sniffing at a den. They did what they could do. The deadbolt, the chain, the door pushed to the jamb as if pry-resistant metal could alter the weight of someone who had chosen to come. Their hands shook when they checked the locks. They pulled curtains shut with the exaggerated care of someone performing safety. They told themselves stories, that it was a raccoon, that it was the neighbor's kid, that the wind had learned to walk. And none of those worked. Then the intruder knocked. Not a polite knock, not a deliberate knock to be announced. A soft, considered tapping that implied knowledge of the wood. A voice followed the knocks, low and clear and intimate in a way that made the narrator's stomach fold. The voice didn't shout or demand. It said a sentence like a fact. "I know you're in there, Leo." Those 5 words compressed everything that night was into a single unbearable image. Someone outside the thin wall, using a name the narrator had not given to the rental host, the name they used only around certain people, a name that felt like an exposure. The narrator says they didn't use Leo as their real name. They weren't sure even who in their life had that name for them. And yet the voice said it with the casual certainty of someone who had been in the house before and was checking the drawers for their tea mug. After that, the steps changed. No longer testing the floor, they walked a cadence, toe to heel slow. The heavy impression of boots that pressed the sand off the path like it owed them some kind of signature. The narrator remembers leaning against the door with fear in their teeth, counting breaths, hearing the flashlight sweep the curtains from their peripheral vision. The door's knob trembled once. There was a small bang, as if someone had thrown themselves against the wood to see if it would give. Dawn came thin and grey. In the morning the narrator walked out, and the world looked normal in the way morning can lie. But the ground did not lie. Bootprints gouged the damp sand in a clear path from the cottage to the dock. Heavy prints, spaced long, leading to the water where an outboard motorboat had pushed off and disappeared into the grey. The narrator touched the footprints and felt the grit under their nails like proof. They called the co-worker who had recommended the place. They told the co-worker about the knocks, the voice, the prints. The co-worker's voice over the phone carried that particular kind of private disbelief, the one you hear when someone either cannot believe what you're saying or is choosing not to. He told them he hadn't told anyone. He told them he didn't know who could have come. The narrator says they tried to get the police involved, but on an off-hours island with no immediate witnesses and no clear evidence of a break-in beyond a few prints, it slid into records and paperwork where it sat like a damp stone. No one returned calls. The lights of the mainland felt like a slow, bureaucratic heat. In the weeks and months after, the narrator describes a sustained, grinding paranoia. They changed locks when they could. They slept with the TV on and a cheap legal pad open with their phone light pinned under it like a watch. They became certain of small sounds in a way that exhausted them. When they told friends, some said the obvious things, that the mind manufactures threats, that a single violent event can be imagined into 1,000. But 2 things stubbornly refused to be assimilated into that explanation. The voice that used a private name with easy familiarity, and the boat tracks gone at dawn. The narrator could not find a reason for how they had been located on an island that had, by all reason, no conscious way of knowing them. They eventually left the island for good. The cottage stayed rented. The listing didn't change. Sometimes they pass the spot online, and the photos still show the porch chairs and the thin curtains. They say the fear doesn't leave you. It simply folds itself into other anxieties until the smallest noise can make your spine list like a ship. They say they sometimes wake up thinking they hear that voice in a different room. Mostly what lingers is the sense that being alone in a place meant for getting away can be something that makes you visible rather than invisible. If hearing your own name spoken from outside your locked door doesn't unsettle you, wait until you hear what the second narrator found in a hollowed-out island that time forgot. Concrete, rust, and the unmistakable evidence someone had been living where no one was supposed to be. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, real island stories that crack the veneer of quiet, hit subscribe and join the channel. I'll be here with more. The second narrator was a structural engineer and a graduate student, someone used to reading decay the way others read weather. They had been invited to Hashima Island by a professor who had arranged a rare research permit, Dr. Yamamoto. They told me this happened many years ago, though their memory of the sequence stayed sharp in the particular sensory edges of the place. Hashima was an island of concrete and gravity, a place where decades of salt and neglect had turned architecture into sculpture. It drew researchers because of the way structures rotted and held stories, layers of paint, metal veins freed from their cages, stairwells that looked like gullet bones. The permit was a big thing. Hashima did not welcome amateur curiosity. You went with supervision and an escort who knew the paths that didn't collapse. The narrator packed light, but with an engineer's attention to risk. Helmet, harness, a headlamp with a halo of cold light, a radio clipped at the shoulder. Dr. Yamamoto met them at the water and handed over paperwork with a soft, professional courtesy. The escort was quiet. The guide, whose name later appears in transcripts multiple ways, the narrator gives the list as they recall it, the guide, name transcribed variously as Tishi, Tishi, Takashi, Keshi. The inconsistency mattered because it was a small sign of how the story itself would refuse to be neat. At first, everything fit the script. Rope lines, safety briefings, restricted zones. Hashima's concrete corridors swallowed sound. The headlamp made small pools of light that revealed rebar and fallen ceiling tiles. But a structural engineer notices patterns others miss. The narrator says the surfaces betrayed recent disturbance. Dust tracked in lines like a fingerprint across a hallway that should have been uniformly stale. In places, the dust was pushed aside as if by a purposeful hand. There was a faint scent that did not belong to concrete at all. A human, unplaceable odor, like the smell of recent breath in a closed room. They were told not to stray. The guide had the radio and spoke into it in a clipped language. The narrator remembers feeling watched, not by cameras. There were none left that worked, but by an absence that carried attention, like the buildings were listening for human signatures. "We'll stick to the route," the guide said, but sometimes the guide would lag and then hurry, the radio squawking static they did not answer. At one point, the narrator saw the guide step into an archway and not come out. They later claimed the guide had just taken a different stair, that the island's maze made delays inevitable. The narrator later tried to pin down the guide's behavior in their own mind, and found only a continuing smear of evasions. A refusal to go up to a certain floor, a refusal to talk about particular rooms. The real shift came when they climbed to an upper floor that had, by every record, been uninhabited for decades. In a corner, under a collapsed skylight, the narrator found a small flat of belongings so clearly recent, it was impossible to assimilate into abandonment. Blankets, not the mold-furred hard sheets you imagine in long, empty places, but relatively clean, folded in the way people fold things when they intend to use them again. Plastic water bottles with a brand sold in the last few years. Their labels were scuffed, but the shape of the bottle was modern. There were shoe prints in the dust around the blankets that carried the slight imprint of rubber treads, and the narrator remembers the flat, terrified clarity of finding a cigarette butt snapped in half, the brand and burn pattern suggesting it had been stubbed out within days, perhaps hours. The guide's radio crackled then, with a voice the narrator could not place, and the escort's face closed off. The guide motioned for them to move, eager to keep the party together. But later, when the narrator actually needed the guide, he was elsewhere. They found themselves in a stairwell that suddenly had new rubble at the bottom, a heap of concrete and twisted metal that blocked the descent. The narrator says the rubble hadn't been there minutes before when they had passed that same stair. They only noticed it when the light in the stairwell shifted and their route back was sealed by weight. Panic, as it does, sharpened the senses into a magnifying glass. The most ordinary sounds in the island's throat became meaningful. A drip that might be a leak became the pulse of someone moving. A soft scrape along a corridor could be a shoe or something gentler, a hand. They began to hear footsteps that were not theirs, many sets overlapping, not aligned with the geometry of the building. Where would someone be walking in a place declared uninhabitable, among floors caving in and rusted ladders? The narrator listened to a soundscape that refused to explain itself and thought about who might have settled in the skeleton of the island and why. They tried to leave the building and met the guide at the dock. He moved with a casual air, as if the blankets and water bottles were part of an everyday arrangement. as if someone living in the half-collapsed upper floors were as unsurprising as gulls. "People pass through," he said in a clipped tone the narrator describes as almost rehearsed. The narrator asked questions that were professional and pointed. "How many? When did you see them last? Are they transient?" The guide either deflected or offered answers that never quite glued to the evidence. A shrug, a suggestion that storm refugees have always used Hashima's nooks, that sometimes fishermen leave supplies. Dr. Yamamoto, the narrator later tried to call. He became unreachable in a way that increased the narrator's sense of being cut off from authority rather than supported by it. Calls went unanswered. Emails returned a polite, automated message. The narrator could not tell whether the professor was avoiding them or genuinely unable to reply, or if something stranger had already interrupted the channels of validation. As the day slid into the folded grey light of late afternoon, the narrator made notes in a small, damp notebook. They photographed the blanket area with their camera, making extra copies to send to Dr. Yamamoto. They took wide shots of the stairwell, the rubble, the paths of dust. The camera froze things into a false solidity. Photographs feel like proof until you realize proof is something other people adjudicate. They left the island angry, then anxious, then resigned to the fact that institutions sometimes let evidence sit under papers. But the narrator could not unhear the footsteps that had made no sense, and could not unsee the blankets folded like people were preparing to go to sleep, but didn't. There was a particular moment, they said, standing with the harbour wind carving at their coat, when they realized that being given access to a place sometimes means you're being asked to keep knowledge in your head. The narrator felt both honored to have been allowed into Hashima and eroded by the sense that whatever they had found might be something the gatekeepers preferred to leave unremarked. The guide's casualness at the dock felt like complicity or denial. The narrator could not decide which. Even now, they told me, the memory of that island smells the way it smelled that day. Metallic, and something like a breath exhaled into a closed room. They tried to press the matter with Dr. Yamamoto and the university. Replies were slow or never came. Papers that depended on the site's conditions ran into administrative doors. The narrator's photographs sat in a folder on their desktop, a small shrine of questions. They started sleeping with their phone under their pillow again. Not because of the Maine voice, but because the thought of people living in a place no one would check made them consider what else could exist in the spaces we declare abandoned. They also became aware of a different kind of fear, not the immediate terror of a man outside a thin door, but the unease that comes from being entrusted with something no one else seems to want to confirm. What do you do with the knowledge that people were living inside a place that everyone else has marked as forbidden? Tell someone and be dismissed. Publish and be ignored. The narrator's professional instincts wanted catalogues and diagrams, while a quieter part of them wanted to scream, not at the island, but at the human systems that let people exist in the margins. What happened next is where the account bends and leaves space. The narrator tells of footsteps multiplying in the night, of a radio call that was never answered, of finding a stairwell suddenly blocked. They speak of walking with the muscle memory of a man trained to measure stress in beams, translating those measurements into the social stress of being unheeded. They say they felt the island watching them not as a place, but as a community that had been allowed to form in secret, and that the members of that community did not want to be catalogued. The narrator also says the guide's name, transcribed variously as Tishi, Tishi, Tekashi, Keshi, matters because it's slippery. No single spelling anchors him, and in that slipperiness the narrator found a small echo of the island itself. Nothing here wants to be pinned down. At a certain point during the day, the narrator climbed into a room where the headlamp caught something that stopped being a detail and became a verdict. Blankets were folded neatly. Water bottles sat in a crooked line against a wall. There was the smell of recent cooking, of food dry and split open and not yet eaten. A radio sat on a windowsill, its knob turned to a frequency that played static and, when the winds were right, the faint intrusions of voices. The narrator later gave me a list of small things that did not belong together. A modern brand of bottle next to a cigarette butt of a brand only sold on the mainland. A child's plastic toy, scuffed, lying under an upturned bucket. That was where I stopped them and asked what the thing that bothers them most about Hashima is. It wasn't the discovery, they said. It was the way leaving felt like closing a book on people who were still living inside the pages. They don't know if the people were transient fishermen, squatters, escaped from somewhere else, or inhabitants of the island who had learned to live alongside rot. They know only that the signs were there, and the signs were recent, and that being shown the place by people who should have looked after it left the narrator feeling both safer and more vulnerable. Safer because they had permission, more vulnerable because they carried the knowledge alone. Their story does not end cleanly. There were attempts to follow up. There were uncertain exchanges with Dr. Yamamoto. There was a moment when a pile of concrete sealed a stairwell, and the narrator had to decide whether to press on into a structure that might be structurally unsound, or to treat human signs as secondary to physical safety. In the middle of those choices, the guided group split, and the radio went hollow. The narrator pressed the button, their voice small inside it, and heard nothing but static in reply. Then, in the corridor beyond the blocked stair, they heard a pattern of footsteps that could have been human, could have been mechanical, could have been very many things. They moved toward the sound because that is what investigators do, and because leaving felt to them like a moral abdication. When they reached the landing, they found signs that suggested presence but not occupancy. A blanket folded halfway, a water bottle that had traces of condensation still clinging to its sides, footprints that did not seem to belong to any of the team. I asked them to describe the footprints. They said they were of modern manufacture, the kind you see on cheap sneakers, not the heavy boot prints of fishermen. They could have been left in a day, the narrator said. They could have been left last month. They could have been left yesterday. We don't know. That last sentence is the one that keeps circling in their head, that not knowing is a shape that sat in their ribs long after the island water carried them back to the mainland. There was one other thing, the way authority unwound. The guide acted oddly nonchalant at the dock, as if the presence of people in forbidden rooms was a matter of habit rather than crisis. Dr. Yamamoto, reachable by the university channels, began to recede into bureaucracy. The narrator felt the institutional scaffolding that should have held the truth in place weaken under their hands. The photographs sat on a hard drive. Emails sat in an outbox. The island kept its secrets in concrete. The narrator kept theirs in a dream that smelled of iron. And then, at the thin electric edge, where I was finally asking whether the narrator believed the island had been home to something other than humans, they paused and gave one of those professional shrugs that is more about helplessness than technique. "I'm an engineer," they said. "I don't deal in ghosts. I deal in structures. All I can tell you is what I saw and what I measured. What I couldn't measure is the human thing, the way people had kept themselves alive in the margins." They left Hashima with photographs and a tightening at the base of the skull that never quite released. It felt wrong, the way wrongs about abandoned places do when they are left unredressed. The narrator still has the images and the smell in their memory, and the intermittent calls. No one answered. They carry a sense that something was living inside the island's bones, and that whatever it was, it did not want to be the subject of papers and panels. That's where the account moves into territory that I'll pick up more of later. The stairwell blocked by rubble, the radio that returned only static, the guide's evasive behavior. It's the moment where a researcher realizes that documenting a site can make you complicit in someone else's erasure, and the silence from the authorities feels less like oversight and more like a structural decision to ignore. What the narrator doesn't know is whether they were observed as an interloper, as someone who had stumbled into a human settlement by mistake, or whether the people who lived there were simply there in a way that had nothing to do with the mainland's classifications. They can't be sure if they were merely an audience for a community's secret, or if they had brushed up against something more deliberate. All they can tell you is the facts they had: blankets, water bottles, footprints, a blocked stairwell, a radio tuned to static. And they can tell you this: leaving the island felt like closing a lid on a room where people still breathed. I want to carry you to the third account, but this is where I leave the Hashima narrator for now, because the second tale, like the first, ends in friction, in a bureaucratic quiet that refuses to close the wound. The next story is different in tempo, but not in dread. It's about college kids and a night's illicit exploration on North Brother Island, a place that promises ruin and delivers a human voice that copies what it hears. I'll tell you what happens there, and I'll tell you how it looks in the cold light of morning. But first, I want you to feel the way the second narrator did. The knowledge that a place designated as empty can be full in the worst possible ways, and that being allowed in doesn't always equal being safe. When we come back, you'll hear about Jesse and Jansen, and the night their friend heard a voice calling like him from somewhere no one could have been. You'll hear the shape of the scream and the slow reciprocation of the sea as dawn pulled them away. For now, hold the image of the folded blanket on the concrete floor and the unsteady metallic smell of Hashima after a long night. The third narrator was a college senior, the kind of person for whom abandoned buildings are research material and midnight is a deadline. They were working on a history thesis, and North Brother, the island just off a busy, indifferent mainland, was a name that lived in footnotes and old municipal reports. To them, it promised ruin and detail, a thesis chapter that would sing. They convinced two friends to come: Jansen, steady and quieter than the narrator, and Jesse, who had the easy, reckless laugh that made strangers warm up fast. It was last year, the narrator says, and the memory of the night is folded into the exactness of preparation. A rented kayak, headlamps with fresh batteries tucked into waterproof cases, a thermos of coffee, and a sober sense that what they were doing was illegal, trespassing to get material for scholarship. That illegality is important in how the story unspools. There was no permission, no oversight. The island, the narrator remembers, is small enough to circle by foot in a single hour in daylight. At night, its paths become mistakes. They landed in the deep dark when the moon was a thin line, and the mainland's lights washed the horizon like a promise they'd left behind. For a while, the night felt like the kind that rewards audacity. The decay is photogenic, peeling paint and rusted railings. The patient way a hospital bed becomes a skeleton. They made notes under headlamp halos, mapping rooms and doorways for the thesis. The island smelled of old chemicals and the sick, sweet rot of damp upholstery. Their voices were small in the corridors. At some point, as often happens when curiosity runs long into cold and fatigue, the friends split up. Not because they planned to, because ruins eat attention. Jansen trailed into a low wing that had been catalogued as a therapy ward. Jesse wandered toward a stair that spiraled up to a tower. The narrator followed a corridor that led to a narrow, windowless room where the air was thicker. They remember the small decisions, like a film of slow motion, turning the headlamp down to save batteries, tucking the camera strap into a coat, the way a footfall sounded hollow and higher than it should have in an empty building. Then they heard a voice call from down a corridor. At first they thought it was Jesse. The sound matched, the cadence, the accent, the lazy little inflection Jesse used when he was joking. The narrator calls it the most ordinary thing in the world to hear your friend's voice on an island where you think you're alone. You relax, you answer. They called back. No one answered. The voice called again, closer, unmistakably mimicking Jesse's tone. The narrator remembers the hair at the back of their neck prickling. The brain does quick arithmetic. Jesse called from the tower. Jesse called toward the shore. The sounds don't match. The logic phrase. They moved toward the voice, assuming they were walking to meet a friend. The corridor opened into a dark room. The headlamp circle caught a figure. Not a man in profile, a person tall enough to make the room feel smaller. The figure stood facing the wall, arms hanging loose, shoulders hunched in a way that suggested whatever they were doing, staring at the wall, listening, would not involve meeting anyone's eyes. At first, the narrator thought it was Jesse, a prank carried to an uncomfortable place, but there was something wrong about the posture, about the way the outline kept still like a sculpture misassembled. "Jesse," the narrator said aloud, the name a thing they expected to be returned with a laugh. There was no laugh. The figure did not turn. The headlamp washed the back of a jacket that might have once been military, the shoulders too broad, the neck too long, as if the coat was stuffed and then forgotten. For a moment the narrator's brain supplied explanations, a mannequin left by a film crew, a coat draped on a post. When the figure moved, subtly, the shift barely enough to suggest breathing, the narrator realized they weren't looking at a prank. They let out a sound, a high, involuntary sound that had more animal in it than they liked to admit. They backed into the corridor and felt the cheap headlamp bump against a wall. The sound the narrator made startled the island, like a small stone thrown into still water. They ran toward the stair, where they thought Jesse might be. Voices merged into the building's throat, the ocean outside, the skitter of wind, their own heartbeat. Jansen and Jesse were where they had left them, the narrator says, both leaning against a shore rail where the dark broke into a knife-edge horizon. Jesse looked at them with a face that made the narrator's stomach drop. Confused, incredulous, wholly present. Jesse had not been in that tower. Jesse had been with Jansen, sitting on the rocks writing notes, when the narrator heard the call that sounded like his voice. "We were together the whole time," Jesse kept saying, and what haunted the narrator most wasn't Jesse's denial, but the way the voice that had called out earlier had sounded exactly like him. It had the right vowels, the familiar inflection. It had jokes inside it. It had a small, private cadence that the narrator knew like the shape of their own signature. Yet Jesse was not on the other side of the wall where the figure stood. He was here, on the rocks, colder than the narrator felt comfortable with, the ocean sucking at his shoes. The three of them tried to make it sensible. They checked each other's pockets for phones. They compared timestamps of photos. They retraced the steps. The narrator walked back to the room with the tall figure, heart a drum and breath short. When they reached the doorway, the figure had vanished. There was no trace, no coat on the floor, no footprint, no dropped cigarette. The wall it had faced had a smear of something dark, as if the figure had leaned and left the residue of who knows what. The narrator ran their fingers across it and found only flaking paint and the faint scent of someone else's perfume, a smell that in the hours that followed would lodge in memory like a lodged splinter. They left the building once more, and then the night decided to offer them another thing. As they gathered kayaks and pulled at the straps, they heard a sound that made them stop and hold it in their lungs. A soft moan came from inside the island like wind, trying to speak in a language it had forgotten. The narrator describes it as thin and bent, like a woman groaning with pain, old and privy to a long sorrow. It made their teeth feel hollow. The moan curled around the buildings and then resolved into something else. A near replica of Jesse's voice, quieter, threaded with strain, calling a name in the way their friend would if he were hurt. But Jesse was here, alive and angry at the accusation of absence. The three of them launched into the grey like men trying to outrun a memory. They paddled with the rawness of people who had seen something they couldn't place. The water took them along a measured arc, and as dawn pried the sky apart, the island's silhouette shrank from malevolence to a pile of boards and concrete. Morning light makes for daylight rationalizations. The narrator says the rationalizations came in waves. The island echoes. Your brain fills the spaces with familiar sounds. Someone elsewhere is mocking you. But even as they returned to campus and to deadlines, the sound remained lodged in the narrator's head like a recording that would not stop playing. They wondered for weeks after whether someone had invented the voice, whether some person on the island had learned the cadence that would produce the exactness of Jesse's laugh. They became convinced of the possibility that a stranger could mimic familiarity perfectly. They rehearsed scenarios. A local fisherman named Tom, who had known Jesse once, a prankster with uncanny talent for impressions, an elaborate, cruel coincidence. Then the narrator would remember the tall figure in the dark and the smear on the wall, details that never fit an impressionist's neat, lucky mimic. What haunted the narrator most was not the prickle of fear, but the way uncertainty tightened around small certainties. They could not prove that the voice was not Jesse. They could not prove that the figure in the tower wasn't a trick of light. They could not point to a person who had been on the island and been responsible. They could only describe the night with the rawness of someone steeped in a small, private terror. The voice that was Jesse, but not Jesse. The figure that faced the wall and refused to be named. The moan like someone hurt and old that still lingers in the memory like a bruise. Months later, the narrator says they still question. They replay the night's audio, recordings where the voice is muffled and unhelpful. But the files offer nothing conclusive. They wonder if an explanation would make it easier to sleep. They worry that seeking clarity will invite ridicule. They keep the thesis and the notes and the photographs in a folder named with a date that no longer feels anchored. Sometimes, in the subway or in a quiet apartment, they'll think they hear Jesse in the distance, and the muscle that the island tightened relaxes again. A physical thing that proves fear leaves markers on the body. These three stories: a cottage in Maine, where a person called you by a private name from outside the door, an industrial island where clean blankets and water bottles refused to behave like trash, and a night on North Brother where a friend's voice was borrowed from somewhere impossible, share the same contour. Each begins with an intention of leaving, to recover, to study, to gather material. Each turns the very thing promised as refuge, the island's isolation, into a lens that sharpens the unknown. Each ends not with answers, but with a residue: bootprints in sand, folded blankets on concrete, a voice that mimics names. There is no tidy closure. Listen to what ties them together. First, isolation amplifies the smallest oddities until they become proof. Alone, a creek might be a raccoon. Alone with no salt-stiff neighbor, a creek becomes a methodical walker. Second, there is the uncanny familiarity. Being called by a private name, hearing a laugh that belongs to a friend, smelling a breath that suggests someone lived there last night. Familiarity is intimate. It implies inside knowledge. It implies search. Third, the authority figures in each account: a co-worker who denies passing the name, a professor who becomes unreachable, the absence of law enforcement on an off-hours island. Retreat when a sustained answer is needed. The structures we expect to hold truth, people, institutions, systems, fail to fix these stories into facts. That failure is a kind of violence, not the dramatic sort that gets headlines, but the quiet one that leaves people carrying things like unease and suspicion until they grow into patterns. There is also another strand. Each narrator becomes someone who has been asked to keep a story that won't sit down. The main narrator carries a name spoken outside a door like a needle under skin. The Hashima narrator carries photographs and the smell of iron and the puzzle of a guide whose name changes like a broken label. The college narrator carries audio files and a smear on a wall that refuses to explain itself. None of them find the kind of closure that lets you sleep through the night without starting at small noises. They carry the kind of knowledge that makes ordinary days heavier. I'm careful with what I say because these are reported true accounts. I'm careful because the narrators asked for anonymity, or because details are hazy in ways that matter. I'm careful because there are people behind these words who felt exposed in places meant for privacy or for institutional neglect. I'm careful because there is a moral shape to retelling. The stories are their property, but they have shared them with the explicit hope someone will listen, not to gawk, but to attend. That listening is part of what these islands demand. Islands are supposed to be escape routes into quiet. Every one of these narrators left the mainland to find solitude, and came away with the understanding that solitude is porous. It exposes you to tracking. It hands your name to someone who might ring it like a bell. It lets communities form in the margins where institutions will not look. It offers a human voice the space to be reused, repeated, imitated. The strange thing is that the worst violations aren't obvious. They're small and clinical, like the imprint of a boot in sand or a folded blanket in a ruin. Those are the things that don't make good television, but make for a life changed. And then there's what these accounts do to a person in the long term. The main narrator became habitually alert. The Hashima narrator woke up with phantom smells of iron. The college narrator found laughter less easy to trust. These are not dramatic plot points. They are the slow friction of living with a knowledge that certain places conceal more than they reveal. When your world contains a locked door, a hidden community, or an uncanny voice, you begin to translate ordinary sounds into possible threat vectors. You live a quieter life. You avoid small choices. That is the psychological aftermath that sometimes feels heavier than the event itself. There is also a final stubborn question these stories leave. What do we owe the places we declare abandoned? When a place is catalogued as uninhabitable, does that give us the right to close the books on the people who might still be there? The Hashima narrator's deepest frustration was not the discovery itself, but the way leaving felt like closing a cover on people still breathing. The main narrator's deepest wound was being made visible in a place meant for invisibility. The college narrator's deepest unease was having a friend's face used as a bridge in an unexplainable way. Each story circles this ethical knot, that spaces hold lives even when authorities claim otherwise, and that recognizing that may demand more than photos or a police report. It may demand attention that our institutions are not structured to give. I'll leave you with one image that has not left me since I first heard these accounts. The thinness of an island's edge. The way salt air thins you out until you feel exposed. Islands are places of margins. Margins in law, in oversight, in rescue. Their very isolation is an invitation. Sometimes that invitation is benign, a photograph, a quiet weekend. Sometimes it is a call that uses your private name. Sometimes it is a blanket on a concrete floor. Sometimes it is a voice that sounds like a friend in a place they couldn't be. If any of these stories touch something in you, fear, recognition, a memory of being alone and listened to, consider sharing in the comments. If you've ever been to a deserted island or have a similar account, tell us what happened and how it changed you. And if you want more real island tales that linger in the way these do, subscribe and join the channel. I'll be here, listening.